we had nearly finished Christology, and I think that verses 2:9 through 2:11, chapter 2, verses 9 through 11 are the only thing that I had wanted to read, but we hadn't had time for it. So let's take a look, chapter 2, verse 9. So starting at verse 7, he's quoting from Psalm 8. And so the quotation from Psalm 8, you made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. So Psalm 8 is actually a commentary on the first creation story in Genesis and God giving humankind dominion. The author interprets it very differently. He says, now in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. As it is, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him there being humankind. But we see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one origin. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brethren. So he's mixing he's mixing Jesus as man and Jesus as God. And he's mixing them because God alone, we cannot call God alone brother, nor can we, simply, there has to be something that bridges that chasm between humankind and the divinity. And that chasm can only be bridged by a divine being who took on human form and was also fully human. So he mixes all of those things. And that in turn leads him to see the dominion in the first creation story as not a current promise, but an eschatological one, that Jesus has dominion and we will have dominion
When,
at the
when,
end of time.
when did Jesus become higher than the angels? Upon his death or upon his acknowledgement as being the Son of God?
Well, I mean, in fact, he is higher than the angels because he's the Son of God.
That's what I always thought. But when we
On the,
talk about here,
on the other hand, so
for a little while,
his focus is not purely on Jesus as divine. It's on Jesus as mediator.
okay.
And so remember that angels are messengers. The law was given through angels. The Mosaic law was thought to be given through angels. And so the Mosaic law represents the defines the relationship between God and man and what you need to do to approach God. And barring some change, it remains in force. So then how can it be superseded and it has to be superseded by a divine being who is also man. And also, that divine being has to fully experience the human condition and be perfected through suffering. So he talks about the notion of being perfected. Perfection is the ability to approach God or to stand before God. And so Christ is perfected through suffering because through suffering, he experiences the whole of the human condition and therefore understands what it means to be human, what it means to be tempted by sin, what it means to suffer, what it means to be rejected, which in turn, both as God and man, qualifies him to mediate between God and man, and therefore we can call him brother, and we are his brethren. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, so a high Christology. Hi, Thais.
Hello.
It's good to see you, even though we, of course,
Don't see me.
can't
Nice to
see
hear
you.
her.
Don't see you.
Okay, it's good to hear me, I guess.
Good to hear you. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, so then high Christology and what many scholars have done is quite kind of dated the books of the New Testament based on their Christology. And so they generally, the current widely accepted view is that Mark is the first gospel. It's in some sense the least Christological of the three, followed by Matthew and Luke, and then John, which was written in about 100, or many push the date later than that, is the most Christological of the Gospels. And then Hebrews has high Christology, so that would argue that it should be position dated somewhere in the neighborhood of John, which is 100, 120, who knows what, but sort of late. So what's is that does that make sense? Is that correct? And the first thing to note here is that we have a self-justifying hypothesis, right? So we hypothesize that the date of a textual document is reflected in its degree of Christology, right? And then we line up and date the documents based on that hypothesis. So the hypothesis determines the dating without any ability to independently determine the dating. So we always have to be careful about sort of self-fulfilling hypotheses. That's a common problem in thinking. It's a common problem in analysis. It's a common problem among some historians. Common problem in some textual analysis. So, what if we, ignoring the notion that Christology determines date, what seems to be a likely date? And so broadly, we have two options: sometime after 70 and sometime before 70.
And when did you say John was?
About 100.
So that would, if you thought it was before, would it put it before John? Hebrew?
Well, that's the question. Was it before or after John, but was it before or after 70?
Well, if you look at the beginning of Hebrews, it says that the epistle probably was written before 70 AD, the date of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem.
Uh-huh.
And it says destruction is not mentioned, and the animal sacrifices of the temple are spoken of in present tense, as if they were continuing at the time of the writing. There are some scholars, however, who take a different interpretation and hold that Hebrews was written after 80 AD.
Uh-huh.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
So
Well, so
do we believe that?
do we? That brief excerpt points out that he uses the present tense to discuss the Day of Atonement, the Levitical priesthood. And that's significant. And so remember that this is probably the most literary work of the New Testament. It's written in very polished Greek. I mean, we've been examining the way in which every new portion of Hebrews links to something in previous portions. It's a really carefully woven argument. He's very precise for the most part in his language. And I would say really that where people think he's imprecise and there's significant debate about meaning, that it's mostly because of confusion on the part of interpreters less than a lack of clarity on the part of the author. I think we've seen that as well as we've been looking at areas of lack of clarity. So the use of the present tense is significant. Also, in chapter 2, in verse 3, I think we read this last week, but with a different meaning. But starting in verse 2, this is part of his higher than the angels argument. For if the message declared by angels was valid, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard him, while God also bore witness, etc. So it was attested to us by those who heard him. So those who heard him are still around. That argues, or sort of fairly early. There are still people who have heard Jesus. Chapter 8, verse 13. In speaking of a new covenant, he treats the first as obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So that assumes that what is growing old and becoming obsolete is still in existence. And remember that what he's not focusing on the whole of the Mosaic law. He's really focusing on the system of sacrifice. And he's focusing on the system of sacrifice because the system of sacrifice is the way in which the people of God are able to approach God. So, I mean, he makes some digs and comments about the purity laws and the dietary laws and whatever, but those are really only in passing and only incidental. His focus is on the sacrificial system and especially the Day of Atonement, as we've seen. So that's the thing that is That's the thing that is becoming obsolete, growing old, and ready to vanish away. So if it's getting ready to vanish away, it hasn't vanished away yet. So that's a very telling statement. And then finally, we have, so this is a very carefully argued work that aims to show Jewish Christians thinking of returning to Judaism and the Mosaic Law that something better is here and that there are consequences for returning that are rather dire. If the temple system had vanished, if it had been destroyed, then he would certainly have pointed that out in making his argument. Like, you want to go back to the Mosaic law, so what are you going to go back to?
Hmm.
How under the Mosaic law, as it can now be observed, can you stand before God? How can you approach God? There's no longer a mechanism to do that, because that mechanism was the temple. I mean, the purity laws are, I mean, really sort of set apart. Set apart. They don't concern how the people of God approach God. They concern how an individual can be worthy to approach God. So they're very, sort of, the entire people of God don't become ritually impure. Only a person does, or a group of people, but it's through sacrifice, and especially through the Day of Atonement, that the entire people of God can approach God. So if you're thinking of going back and there's no temple system, what are you going back to?
When you
That's
read
absolutely.
Hebrews 9, 11, it says, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, this is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, taking not the blood of goats and calves, but his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption.
Mm-hmm. Right. So this is implicit typology. Then in verse 13, he also says, for if the sprinkling of defiled persons with the blood of goats and bulls with the ashes of a heifer sanctifies for the purification of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit, etc. So notice that's present tense.
Yeah.
So these are all present tense, and he is careful about tenses. So the clear conclusion is that this is written before the destruction of the temple.
Hmm.
I think that any other conclusion is absolutely absurd. There's no basis whatsoever for it.
And then verse 16, for where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will
Mhm.
takes effect only at death, since it is not force. So this I've got written down here. This is a testament.
Right. It's a testament. Yeah. Um, yeah, we should return to that when we get there. I don't fully remember the will is a mistrend, or The will is a common translation and a common understanding, but it's really both a mistranslation and a misunderstanding, since he's consistently talked about covenant. And here he's talking, actually, I do remember slightly, he's talking about a broken covenant, but we'll get there eventually. So next is in chapter 3, a comparison to Moses. In chapter 3, verse 2, Jesus is higher than the angels. Then in chapter 3, verse 2, he was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in God's house. Yet Jesus has been counted worthy of as much more glory than Moses, as the builder of a house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful over God's house as a son. So why is he bringing Moses into the discussion? What purpose does that serve?
You showed Jesus as the new Moses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. So one of the things is that, remember in Deuteronomy, Moses quotes God as saying, I will send you a prophet like me, him you should obey. So Jesus then is the new Moses. So there's an element of typology that Moses is a type, Jesus is the antitype. But then also, what did Moses do?
Gave them the
Within
10 Commandments.
uh, more broadly, the Ten Commandments, you're on the right track.
Expose them to the sins that they were committing with the golden calf and everything.
Well, the Ten Commandments was sort of correct but too narrow.
He brought
Okay.
a covenant, no?
Well,
That was the old covenant.
the old covenant and the law. Moses was the giver of the law.
Right.
And so here again, so Moses, Jesus is the new Moses, but also to testify of the things that will be spoken later. What is spoken later? So we have Moses as the giver of the law, the old of a covenant. We have the prophets, particularly Jeremiah, speaking of a new covenant, and the author quotes Jeremiah. So that's something that was testified later after Moses. And the new covenant itself, as introduced by Christ, is that the old covenant and the law spoken by Moses points forward to that typologically. So, in that sense, Moses is, occupies a really critical place. He's the giver of the law, the greatest of the prophets, the inaugurator of the old covenant. And so, if the new covenant is greater than the old covenant, the giver of the new covenant has to be greater than the giver of the old covenant. And so that becomes a typological relationship. And then implicitly here, although he doesn't use the word covenant, that introduces the notion of covenant. And covenant is critically important for his argument. So then Moses failed to lead his people into the promised land. That entire generation perished in the wilderness. So that's the next part, which actually goes from chapter 3, verse 7 through chapter 4, verse 11. And it includes a quotation from Psalm 95, as well as sort of an extended commentary on Psalm 95. Why is that important? And why is Psalm 95 important?
Is that the part where it says, today when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts?
Uh-huh,
As
right.
in rebellion.
Uh-huh, right.
That's Psalm 95.
Mm-hmm. And we can read Psalm 95. It begins as being a song of worship and a psalm of worship and praise to God. And then as the warning or the admonition to hear God's voice. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he made it. For his hands formed the dry land. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Oh, and so here it changes to admonition or even warning. Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Harden not your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I was wearied of that generation and said, they are a people who err in heart. They do not regard my ways. Therefore I swore in my anger that they should not enter my rest. This is a translation from the Masoretic text, which differs slightly from the Septuagint, which is what the author used. So remember, in every case where there's a difference, we can see that the author uses the Septuagint and never uses the Masoretic text, which leads to the conclusion that he doesn't use the Masoretic text and probably doesn't know Hebrew. So he's a Hellenized Jew. Harden not your hearts. Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Therefore I swore in my anger that they should not enter my rest. So how does he understand that part of the psalm? As he repeats that a number of times in this section. He begins by quoting that portion, that admonition portion of the psalm. Then in verse 13, he says, but exhort one another every day as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened. Then in verse 15, well, it is said, today when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Then in chapter 4, verse 5, he says, they shall never enter my rest. And in verse 7, today when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. How is he interpreting, what is he interpreting the psalm to mean? How is he using it?
Well, and there's a line in the second part of verse 17. Was it not those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? So he's trying to warn people
Mm-hmm.
that there, and it said, and verse 19, he says, so we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a warning.
Right, it's a warning, but it's also more than that. It's a warning and a promise. So what is rest?
Being focused on Christ and what he promises. Rest is being in.
Yeah. Well, that's rest has multiple dimensions, right? So what is rest within the original context? What does it mean for the Israelites to enter God's rest?
Enter into his kingdom.
Not his kingdom.
In the promised land, no?
Into the promised land.
Okay.
Right, rest is entering into the promised land.
Okay.
But although the wilderness generation failed, they did enter the promised land under Joshua. Right. So that promise, that kind of rest has been accomplished. But the psalm still talks about rest. And the psalm, so the psalm is obviously later than the Exodus event and the wilderness generation, but it still talks about it, about rest. It uses, today hear his voice in the present tense so that you not be like the Exodus generation that perished in the wilderness. And so hardness of heart is not hearing his voice is an obstacle to entering rest. So then, if the first rest has been accomplished, there has to be another rest. And so here again, this is typological. That first rest points forward to a greater rest. And what is that greater rest?
I think Carmen said it. Is that the kingdom of God?
Right, that rest is the kingdom of God.
Carmen, I wasn't going to take credit. I heard you say it. But you know, Ron, when I looked at this they should never enter into my rest. I never looked at the promised land as being the resting. I thought because they sinned and even after hearing God's voice, they remained in the desert like a purgatory and they weren't going to get anywhere. So I attributed the rest always to the heaven. And
Moses wasn't allowed to go into the
Moses was not allowed.
promised land.
He was the carrier of the rules and he obeyed the rules. So he would be allowed rest.
There are a couple of things. I mean, first of all, Moses struck the rock and showed anger rather than patience toward God's people. So in doing that, he disobeyed God and sinned, which was why he didn't enter the promised land.
That was his punishment
Yeah, right.
for
But
doing
the
it.
second thing is that we have to be careful to not, sort of impute a later concept to an earlier period. So there is no heaven from the viewpoint of
Okay.
the
Okay.
Israelites. There's the promised land, and you die and you go somewhere, but who knows? And it's really undefined, and everybody goes there anywhere. It's the realm of the dead.
Mhm.
So it's pretty indistinct. It's certainly not heaven. The notion that there's a heaven emerges fairly late in Judaism. And remember, it's still debated, it's still opposed by the Sadducees in Jesus' time. So it's
Yeah,
not like
I
it's,
remember. I know that the Hebrews
yeah.
didn't much think about heaven, but
So rest becomes the kingdom of God. And the important thing about the kingdom of God is that the kingdom of God is not only the heavenly kingdom,
only
the kingdom of God is on earth.
on earth.
It's both, it's eschatological, it's both present and future.
Mhm.
It's realized eschatologically in the present and will be realized eschatologically in its full form in the future. And so, a really big thing that he is implicit here that he doesn't draw out until much later. And actually, that whole the thing you quoted about the will department is where, if it's understood correctly and not translated as testament or will, but as covenant, is the point at which he points out that the covenant, old covenant, was broken. It was broken by the wilderness generation. They couldn't enter rest. And a broken covenant is a broken covenant. It requires that there be a death. And the death of the wilderness generation doesn't satisfy the broken covenant. It's the people of God who have to be sacrificed. And only some of them were. So the psalm refers to Meribah and Massa.
Yeah.
That was when, early in the Exodus, when the people were complaining about the absence of water. But then, about 24 months into the Exodus, so remember, they get to the edge of the promised land after about 24 months in the wilderness. So they're 2 years in the wilderness, and they're now going to have 38 more to go. But they're on the edge of the promised land, and they send the spies to look. And they come back with this report about how the people are big and fearsome, and how the cities are fortified and they can't possibly win. Let's look at Numbers, I think, chapter 14, starting at verse 1. And so in chapter 13, the spies go out, they come back with this really negative report that the Israelites can't possibly win and enter the promised land because it's inhabited by people who are much stronger. And so in chapter 14, verse 1, then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And the sons of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why does the Lord bring us into this land to fall by the sword? And here they're unfortunately prophesying their own fate. Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And then Aaron and Moses tried to intercede. And then in verse 20 of chapter 14, then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly, as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I wrought in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the proof these 10 times, and have not hearkened to my voice. So notice, hearken to my voice, shall see the land which I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despise me shall see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has swallowed me fully, I will bring into the land in which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. And then at some point, God pronounces judgment that they had talked about their wives and children being eaten, but they themselves will fall and be eaten. Just to wrap up this section, so rest remains, typologically a different kind of rest, but that rest is promised in the psalm, which speaks about rest when the promised land has already been entered. It's the first implication of a broken covenant. He doesn't identify that explicitly. That notion is carried forward and then later picked up. It goes back to Moses and the comparison of Moses and Christ. Moses did not enter promised land. So something greater than Moses is here. And Kadesh becomes sort of a symbol of the disobedience of God's people, of their unwillingness to hear and of the severe consequences that follow from it. And so in some sense, we could almost see this as sort of almost a perverse form of anamnesis, if everyone remembers what anamnesis is. Anamnesis takes a current past event and makes it real. And here it's taking a past event and urging you not to make it real because it being real is a real possibility. And you don't want to make that past event real and bring it into the present because it has disastrous consequences. You perish. That's it. So we'll start then with Jesus being introduced as high priest next week.